Welcome into the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Tim Dennis. I promised you a very interesting, potentially dark program today. I'll tell you this much, it's going to be a little lighter than dark today, although the subject today is dark. We're going to talk about demons, but it's a very interesting project. I'll tell you this much, folks. Our guest today, Richard Estep, told me about this book before he began writing it. And I was very excited to find out what this is going to be about. In fact, I've been on pins and needles to read this book. I finally got to read this book, and I'll tell you what, it did not disappoint. In fact, I'll tell you this much. I think it's a paranormal read of 2024. I think you got to go out and get this book. It's from Llewellyn Press. It's called In Search of Demons, Historic Cases and Firsthand Experiences from Experts and Skeptics Alike. Here it is right here. And let me tell you something, folks, it is impressive. There's lots of different paranormal researchers, and I hate to use the word paranormal experts. It's never a word, but in my vocabulary at least, but you've got such dignitaries as Jeff Belanger, MJ Dixon in here, Jason Hawes, Kieran O'Keefe, Robert Murch is in here. Mm-hmm. You've got different cases such as the two famous Exorcist cases in here, from Iowa and from St. Louis, much, much more. We'll talk about it during the program with Richard Estep. Let's get him in here as soon as we can. Richard Estep is not just the foremost author as far as crime and paranormal goes. He's also delved into history, and he is an up and coming and rising name in all genres right now. He is an incredibly intelligent and witty author who, when you sit down to read one of his books, you're riveted. I don't think you can sit down and not finish one of his books in one sitting. By gosh, you're going to be riveted to this one as well. This book is amazing, folks. Richard is located out of Colorado, although for this book, he really put in time, effort, and boots on the ground. Let's bring him in right now, and let's just get moving with this thing. Richard Estep, welcome back to Darkness Radio, my friend.
Hey, Tim, it's great to be back. Thank you for the invitation.
You've outdone yourself, my friend, on this book. This book is something special. And like I said, I think it's a paranormal read of 2024. You really have outdone yourself with this book.
Thank you, Tim. And there's some stiff competition out there. There are some great paranormal writers in the field. So I really appreciate your kind words.
Let me ask you this right off the bat. So I think it's been proven through paranormal programming that there are two camps. And I think you went over it brilliantly with Jason Hawes. You've got the people who want non-demonic programming. You got the people who want demonic programming. You've got the people who want to keep it real, as Jason says. You've got the people who, let's face it, they want the demonic scares that you get. I'll name Ghost Adventures. I'm doing it on my own. Why in 2024 write this book? And let's face it, In Search of Demons is not a book that skews one way or the other. You literally, as an agnostic, are out there trying to find the truth as to whether demons exist. And that's what this book is. You're out there trying to figure out if there is truth to demons. And take a very fair and balanced look at the subject of whether this is a real phenomenon. And it's a brilliant book at that. So why in 2024 take this of staying on the straight and narrow and getting opinions from skeptics and believers alike?
Well, Tim, I looked at, whenever I'm going to look at a book project, I always like to see what somebody else has written on the subject, because you always want to tread new ground. And there are plenty of books on demons out there, but they seem to fall into two camps. One was the unquestioning, believing, faith-based books that, many of them by demonologists that say demons are real, there is no question, and you better be afraid of them because they might be coming to get you. And then there are the hardcore skeptics that say there's no such thing, and you are foolish if you believe in them. This is the 21st century, grow up, which is a very blinkered and I think arrogant view, and it manages to insult the beliefs of half the human race. Which is no mean feat, right? So I was looking for that book that trod the everyman right down the middle path, saying, what is the evidence? The only one I found, and I'm sure there are others out there, but the only one that I found during my search was Troy Taylor's book about the St. Louis exorcism. It's called The Devil Came to St. Louis. Troy, to his credit, as he usually does, lays out the evidence, tells you what he thinks, and lets the reader decide. So, I wanted to write that middle path, but rather than look at just one case, I wanted to look at the phenomenon of demons as a whole. Because whether you believe they're real or not, the fact that we have such widespread belief in them, they're such a part of our culture and our belief system globally, is worthy of study and further thought.
Now, I find it interesting that coming from and you're not shy about it, you're not bashful about it, coming from the side of an agnostic, that you put yourself in the forefront of this book, and you put yourself open to plenty of criticism, which again, I admire you for. And you put yourself and your own investigations in the forefront, talking about such investigations as the Villisca Axe House. And you put your experience at Villisca right there in the forefront as well.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about Villisca first.
Okay.
And talk about that investigation to open up the program. And get your thoughts a little bit about Villisca without spoiling too much about the book. Tell us a little bit about the haunting, first of all, and what is it about it that would make you think that? And first of all, let's go over the haunting in general. Tell us a little bit about the haunting, and then I want to get a little bit into why this could or could not be a demonic haunting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd investigated Villisca in person. I'd written a book about it a few years ago called A Nightmare in Villisca. And as part of that process, and I've spent, many nights in that house, as part of that process, I interviewed people that had various paranormal experiences there. Some said that it was, they think, an aggressive human haunting. Some thought it was more residual, a kind of echo of the tragedy that happened there. And then there were a number of people that said they had such horrific experiences there, they believed them to be demonic, including seeing a snake-like apparition down in the cellar, which, clearly that is not a human appearance, right? A snake-like entity. So I found that fascinating. And considering the evil events which took place in that house during the murders, it was something that I wanted to delve into a little bit further. I did not experience anything in that house I would consider demonic. I think there's plenty of evidence that evil took place there, but for sure it was evil that hid behind a human face.
Now, you go so far as to say during the daytime, it's quite the comfortable house. It's
mm-hmm. It is. If you've ever been to that house, it's number one, I love that if you didn't know its history, you're walking in the door and you are back in time to early 20th century rural America. It just is amazing. The house is period appropriate. There is no electricity in that house still. There is no running water in that house still. So, you have to light it yourself. You have to go out to the barn to use the restroom or use any conveniences unless you bring your own power supplies. So it really allows you to kind of disconnect. If you leave your cell phone outside, it's like time traveling, Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, of course, the house has a real tragic history, and it's very clear that that's the case. You don't forget that, nor should you when you're inside that house. But yeah, you're able to forget sometimes. I've sat in there quietly reading before, just thinking this is what life was like circa 1910, 1915, 1920, before the modernity, before the communications revolution. So as it gets dark, I think that house can sometimes change character a little bit. I've slept in that house as well several times, and it's not a place that I would ever sleep easily.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the actual case itself, the one main suspect that most people think committed the murders, there's a little bit of a controversy as to whether there's a little bit of mental illness with this person, or whether it is truly some sort of I hate to use the word demonic haunting or a bit of a possession case. You bring out in the book, and again, we'll leave this to people to actually read the book to decide, but whether this person had a touch of again, I don't want to use possession. I'm trying to find the right verbiage here, Richard, whether this person had a bit of influence, spiritual influence. That's the word I'm looking for.
Negative spiritual influence?
Yes, negative spiritual influence, or whether it truly was a bit of madness. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think there are actually two main suspects, at least for my money. I know there were several.
Okay.
But, you have the man from the train theory, which is pretty credible.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the Reverend Kelly, which is also quite credible too.
Yes.
In either case, neither of them could have been what we would call mentally well. But anyone that commits a crime like that obviously has a deep pathological psychosis going on. Mm-hmm. So, the question about what we're really talking about is the devil made me do it, right? I mean, that's the kind of argument. Great title for a movie. Someone should do that if it hasn't already been done. But in all seriousness, that defense has never held water in court, because if you allow that to gain traction, then literally every murderer is going to play that card. So do we truly believe that something demonic was at play there? I haven't found any evidence to support that contention. And it's also worth noting, Tim, that the house really didn't have a reputation for being particularly haunted until the 2000s, when Darwin Lynn bought the place, and that's when the ghost stories began, because he restored it to its current state, which is a closer approximation to how it was at the time of the murders. So the house wasn't really the house as such as we see it today until the 2000s, and that's when paranormal enthusiasts started coming to the house. That's when people like us and your viewers started coming to the house. It got a reputation, and who knows what some of those people brought with them, and who knows what they did behind those doors. You don't know what they conjured, what rituals they did. Statistically, I'm sure some people did dark things in that house when they were in there after hours and locked in.
And there's a bit of a hint of that in the book as well, that people might have done some sort of occult rituals in that house as well. The mind is also a terrible thing. We can point that out as well. And we've talked about things on the show before, like tulpas, people conjuring things with the mind and creating ghosts out of nowhere. And we've known that to be true in other investigations as well, that people have created ghosts out of nowhere and installed ghosts in other haunted places.
Yeah. Egregores, tulpas, call them what you will. I think sometimes it's deliberate, and I think sometimes it's not deliberate, but it happens anyway. And we see these stories literally take on a life of their own.
Yeah, exactly. Now, interestingly enough, if I may, you were warned by a couple of psychic friends while you were at the house that you may be under some danger. Now,
I think, Tim, sorry, I think we're talking about the Sallie House now.
Are we talking about the Sallie House?
Yeah. So Villisca is kind of where I started, but then without getting too much into it, I ended up going to the Sallie House. Okay. Mainly because Johnny Hauser at Villisca had a bad experience at the Sallie House with what he considered to be demonic. Okay. Johnny Hauser got burned in that basement. Johnny's a guy that lives next door to a haunted axe murder house. And he told me, I'll do ghosts all day long, but I am staying away from that dark and demonic stuff. Whatever was at the Sallie House, I'm never going back, which, seemed like a good place for me to take my journey to. And we found evidence that somebody had tried to conjure something in that house. I found, for example, a doll that was pierced with pins for occult rituals with the name Zach written on it. Whoever Zach is, and I don't think it's the one we all know in this field, but had been pierced with multiple pins, including one through the crotch.
Yikes.
That had been hidden in a bedroom drawer in the house. But more to the point, there had been occult sigils that were daubed at various points throughout the house. And I consulted with Michelle Belanger, who is the author of the Dictionary of Demons and who wrote the foreword to this book, and showed her the sigils. And she said, it's as if somebody knew just enough to be dangerous. It would be like if you watched an episode of Chicago Med, some kind of medical show on TV, and decided to try surgery for yourself. Right. Somebody had dabbled, and it was her opinion that it was potentially dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. I get that, and I'm sure there are people on the good side of things that think they know just enough about demonology and are dangerous too, and can mess up a good exorcism.
I mean, absolutely. You can mess up anything if you are unskilled in it. The danger is not that you don't know anything. The danger is that you know just enough to be dangerous, right?
Right. But I'm sorry, and I mixed those two up, Sallie House and Villisca. So while you're at the Sallie House, you're warned by two friends of yours, two psychic friends of yours, that you may have something little dark and ominous following you, and that has bad intentions.
Yeah, something not human. And it's worth noting that one of these friends lives 5,000 miles away in the UK, and didn't know, neither of them knew the identity of the location, which is interesting. But they both, told me, one described, one actually sent an image of a tall humanoid figure with elongated fingers, glowing red eyes, and said, this thing is wraith-like. It's not human. And it wants to attach to you. Now, again, as someone who is spiritual but not religious, I do what I consider to be spiritual protection and cleansing. I've done that ever since I had a bad experience bringing something home from a case. So I did that and didn't think too much of it. And when we left that house, there was some odd activity going on. My friend Mike was in the house. The lights switched themselves on, a door slammed, that kind of stuff. Classic garden variety haunting stuff. And I'm maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes out of Atchison, Kansas, heading for Colorado, heading home. It's 3:30 in the morning, Tim. Middle of nowhere, on the freeway. So freeway speeds, right? 78 miles an hour, 3 miles over the 75 speed limit. Don't speed, kids. And all of a sudden, there's this bang. And I'm off the road in a cloud of dust, and I'm very badly shaken. So I make sure I'm okay. I get out of my truck. I walk around, and I have brand new tires because I put a lot of miles on my truck when I do these book trips. I drive thousands of miles, and the driver's side rear tire was shredded. I don't mean flat. I mean it had just come apart at the seams. So when I collected myself, I got it looked at, the place that I bought them from, and they said, well, this is a zipper failure. The whole thing just came apart. They said, we rarely see this happen. It's extremely unusual. When it does, it usually is a super rare manufacturing defect, which is an entirely plausible theory in a brand new tire with less than 5,000 miles on it. But then I talked to my psychic friends who'd warned me, and they both said, the thing in that house does not want you to leave and tell its story. Really? So, yeah. So I went home and I had the biggest salt bath. It was just, I did the Himalayan salt bath and all the cleansing stuff and those kind of things because it's prudent to do so. I'm not saying it was demons, but I am saying the timing was, I was badly shaken. I could easily have been killed. Boy, was the timing something, Also, if you're going to talk about this in advance, I apologize for jumping ahead, but we look at the Earling, Iowa exorcism from the 1920s in this book. And one of the things which happened in that case was that one of the exorcists, I don't know if you recall this, was driving one day, a mysterious black cloud materialized in front of his face, and he crashed his car into a ravine. Yeah. That was believed to be a manifestation of the demonic entity which was possessing the young lady who was being exorcised, Again, what do you believe? It comes down to belief in the end, doesn't it? It does. Accidents happen, coincidences happen, but when people have been in the paranormal field as long as you and I, Tim, we also know this field will stretch your belief in the word coincidence right to its limit and beyond. We will get into Earling, Iowa in a little bit. In fact, we'll segue into that in just a bit, but I want to bring up something that you and I talked about before the show, and that's this. Throughout the book, there's one common theme that keeps coming up, and we had talked about the agnostic side of you, and that's this, that the one thing that comes up from one paranormal researcher to another, or one paranormal, again, I hate using the word expert, but I have no other word for it, from one paranormal guest to another in your book is this, that with agnostics and atheists, they have a certain level of protection because they don't believe in the demonic. So in a way, it puts up a little bit of a shield. So you don't believe, well, by gosh, you're not in any danger of being harmed. It's the ones that believe. I'm sorry, I'll just, no, my bad. I'll throw it to you. It's the ones that believe that put themselves in danger because they open themselves up to being possessed. Correct? Yeah, it's rare that you see exorcism. Very rare that you see, possession in people that don't believe in possession. What interests me about that is, the saying that atheists don't get possessed. It makes me wonder how many times maybe they do, and maybe that is just written off as mental illness. Like maybe that's defaulted to as mental illness, or maybe some degree of belief is necessary, is a prerequisite for possession. I know that whenever I've investigated so-called demonic hauntings, I have this habit of looking at the bookshelves and movie collections of the people when I am asked to visit their residence. I'm immensely nosy. I love to know what people are reading, right? And if you don't have my books on your shelf, I'm heartbroken. I might slip one in. But it tells me something about your beliefs and biases. So more often than not, in these cases, I will look and I will see books and movies like The Conjuring, you know, and The Demonologist, the book about Ed and Lorraine Warren. I'll see these people have a fascination with demons and the darker side of the paranormal, which may make them more vulnerable to it, but it may also mean they're more biased, more predisposed to believe that what's going on is demonic. You know, that creaky floorboard you hear at noon in your well-lit living room is fine. You just write it off. When it's midnight and you've just watched Conjuring 2, all of a sudden it's easier to believe that, you know, this is something dark and demonic. And I've seen people living in fear in their own homes because of that. So our beliefs can be liberating to us as humans, but I think our beliefs can also imprison us and shackle us to false realities sometimes too.
So not if you're agnostic or atheist, you're not necessarily open to being possessed, but yet you are open to being haunted, which I find unusual. I mean, the door is open a little bit. And so when we get a little further down the line here in the program, I want to talk about why that is. And we'll get to that theory here in a bit, because there's some interesting people in the book who maybe leave the door open as to why that is. And we'll get into that theory here in a bit. I do want to talk about some other, and you know what, maybe this is the place where we jump into Earling, because Earling is an interesting case.
Yeah.
I think has combinations of mental illness and has combinations of maybe actual possession, because it's hard to tell. That case is so, and again, this is pre-St. Louis. This is really a combination of, I think the Catholic Church didn't know what to do with this. It was, I think, with Father Theo, it was a combination of, well, is he a Catholic rock star, or is he a Catholic pariah? Can you tell us a little bit about Earling and what exactly this case is?
Yeah, and your answer is yes, he was both of those things. So Earling, Iowa predated The Exorcist by 20 years, took place in the 1920s, but the ergumen, which is the term for someone who's possessed, an ergumen, was a very devout young lady who had already had had an exorcism. I want to say it took place in like 1915. She was very devout and had started to show symptoms of what was believed to be possession. So she began violently hating any signs of Christianity, any symbols of Christianity. So rosaries, crucifixes, prayer books, Bibles. In the church, she wanted to punch the priest in the face. She had these overwhelming violent urges, you know, these blasphemous urges. She began speaking in voices other than her own, profanities, blasphemies, as again, we often see in cases of possession. So she was given an exorcism which seemed to be somewhat successful. And it fascinates me, Tim, because we often think of exorcisms as like one and done. But I learned that some people basically need boosters or top-ups at certain points in their life. So by the late 1920s, her symptoms were back full force. And Father Reisinger, Theophilus Reisinger, and Father Joseph Steiger were the two exorcists that took point on this. And they took her on a train to a small town called Earling, Iowa, which is in the middle of nowhere. Classic small town America. You know, if you're a DC Comics fan, it's basically Smallville. Rural farmland, very nice, very friendly people. However, they're not overly fond on talking about this one thing for which their town is famous, which kind of sucks because there's a big Hollywood movie being filmed right now about this case starring Al Pacino. I believe Pacino's playing Father Reisinger. But anyway, this exorcism took place over the course of several weeks in a convent attached to the church. And the ergumen, who, again, there are a couple of names that she goes by, either Anna or Emma, Schmidt or Eklund. Her identity remains somewhat uncertain to this day, unfortunately. But she starts to show, again, the signs of possession. So this aggression towards members of the clergy, this hatred of God, blasphemous speaking. She starts barking like a dog, meowing like a cat, mooing like a cow, speaking in all these various different voices and animal sounds, you know, as if she's containing a multitude of people. One of the more prominent voices claims to be Judas Iscariot, the disgraced disciple that betrayed Jesus. And Judas states that his intent in possessing Emma/Anna is to drive her to take her own life, which is what Judas is said to have done after having betrayed Jesus and being overcome with guilt. And of course, you know, the church doctrine was very much suicides go to hell. So that was the stated intent. But then there were other voices and personalities, Tim. One claimed to be Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, which was a higher grade demon. And one claimed to be Anna's stepfather, and also the spirit of her stepfather's girlfriend. She claimed that Anna got possessed because she, the girlfriend, stepfather's girlfriend, had tainted her food in some way, which I found fascinating. I'm always interested in what opens the door to possession. And the stepfather, the father's voice claimed that he had made inappropriate advances on his daughter and wanted her for himself, which it's an awful and horrific thing. What it strongly implies to me is that there was a degree of abuse leveled against this poor girl when she was a girl by her own father, which, you know, one can only imagine what damage was done to her emotionally and psychologically because of that.
Right. Okay. So before we go any further, a couple of things about, okay, if it is a demon that's inside of her, in stating that it is Judas Iscariot that's appearing inside of her, logic problems. If we're writing a movie here, logic problems.
Any.
Didn't Jesus forgive Judas?
I don't know. I'm not that up on my theology. But it's worth noting that Judas was not a demon, or at least in my understanding, he was a deeply flawed human. So we think possession, I think maybe the Exorcist movie has done this to us, you know, where you have Pazuzu possessing Reagan. We tend to think a possession by a demon, when in reality, the multitude of voices that came through her, most of them claim to be angry spirits of the dead. So that kind of fascinated me. There were multiple demonic entities, according to the documentation, but there were every bit as many aggressive, I think we would call them low spiritual level, you know, human spirits as well. All these different voices. And then animals.
Yeah, that was the other interesting thing too. You would hear voices of animals. A lot of times she wouldn't move her mouth, but you would hear sounds around her. I was going to say the other thing too is demons are known to lie. So of course it probably wasn't Judas Iscariot that was coming through. But I just find it interesting that I thought Jesus forgave Judas, so therefore, Judas be a demon.
Well, may I add, Tim, as well? I don't know if you've talked a lot or studied a lot on reincarnation.
Okay. Yep.
But it's interesting when you look at reincarnation cases. A lot of people that claim to be the reincarnation of someone, it tends to mostly be someone famous and high level. Like they tend to be, I am the reincarnation of Napoleon, of Cleopatra. There rarely seems to be the reincarnation of Jeff, who cleaned the public toilets, you know, in Aberdeen, right?
Right.
There's always some kind of glamour to it, which makes me very suspicious. Not always, but frequently, which makes me a little bit suspicious of those cases. So, you know, I think that in her case, I'm a little suspicious when you trot out Judas Iscariot. If you're a religious person, short of the devil himself, he's probably the ultimate bad guy, right?
Yes.
In the Christian story, Judas is like the most, forgiven or not, he is one of the most hated individuals in the Bible. Yes. With good reason. So, you know, again, she wasn't claiming to be possessed by some minor functionary.
Right.
Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, and Judas. It's suggestive.
Yeah. Heavy hitters came by to possess her. Yeah.
And we saw this. I know we're jumping ahead and we'll get to it, I'm sure, but we saw this in the St. Louis exorcism when the boy claimed to be possessed by none other than, quote unquote, I am the devil himself. Mm-hmm. You know? Ultimate boss battle, right, Tim?
Yeah. Well, I guess, you know, when he's going to show up, he's going to show up, right?
Right, but it also implies that these high-order demonic entities or their boss have nothing better to do than excursion into a teenage boy or a middle-aged woman in rural Iowa or St. Louis. You know, that's your plan for global domination and winning the war, you know, against the light, is you're going to go inside a middle-aged woman and swear at priests.
Well, you've been to rural Iowa. Doesn't that feel like hell on earth to you, Richard?
You know, they were super. I think it felt very peaceful there, and I really enjoyed the people that would talk to me, which was by no means the majority of them, because they're quite frankly sick of their town having this association. But I asked, you know, why would God, if you believe in God, of course, why would God allow this kind of possession? You know, I see what's in it for the devil, this idea of taking away a soul from God, right? Judas kind of, or the Judas personality said that essentially the demons would win, the devil would win if Anna was driven to take her own life. That deprives God of a soul, and it gains one for the devil by damning her to, you know, fire and brimstone forever. So I see how that works. Why would God allow this? The argument that was made in favor of God allowing this is a really interesting one, and I'd never heard it before. And it was said that Anna was containing these entities herself, so they were not out wreaking havoc in the rest of the world. In other words, she was taking one for the team being the human race, by containing, essentially, she's a demon penitentiary. Okay. Which struck me as a really interesting explanation, because I'd never heard it before. You know, if you're in here, you're not out there doing harm.
Right.
So we kind of see her, the possessed person, as a jail cell for these dark entities. They're causing mischief within her and around her, but not on the bigger stage of life.
That brings up another point that's in the book too, and that is, you know, the actual, when it comes to the actual expelling of the demon, where does the demon go? Right.
Yeah.
And I don't want to jump too far ahead in the Earling case, but you know, you talk about the classic case of when Jesus went to expel the legion of demons.
Yes.
Into pigs, right?
The herd of swine, yeah.
Into swine. You know, as to where do you put, you know, Beelzebub and Judas Iscariot? You know, it's a whole nother thing, which I suppose as we begin to wrap up the Earling case, I mean, you're dealing with, or are you dealing with? Let's get to the psychiatric part of this case. Are you really dealing with a demon here? Because it seems like with Emma or Anna or whoever she is, there are other signs here that maybe she isn't truly possessed. What is she showing here that maybe suggests that she isn't possessed?
Well, there are rational, i.e. non-paranormal explanations for a lot of this. So, for example, the incredible strength that we see, and this is something that Hollywood shows very well, right? Where you see somebody being held down by like 6 grown men, and they are thrashing and shoving them off and throwing kicks and punches. Well, a lot of that, I think, can be explained away by adrenaline. But what's fascinating in this case is that Anna was regularly vomiting up her food and wouldn't keep her food down. She was not intaking liquids like she should. So this is someone that should have electrolyte imbalances, metabolic imbalances. By the time we're weeks into this process, she should be as weak as a baby. And if you look at a case I didn't cover in this book, the exorcism of Anna Michelle, you know, which ended in a death, tragically, that poor girl was malnourished and essentially starved to death as part of the exorcism process, right? Well, it didn't go that far in Earling, but logically, she should have gotten consistently weaker as time went on. But there are these accounts of her, again, continually pushing and thrashing and smashing and jumping up and clinging to door frames and things like that when she wasn't restrained, which I found interesting, you know? Also interesting to me was that the kitchen staff at the convent, the sisters, they would sometimes slip holy water into her food. They would sprinkle holy water onto her food. Now, she couldn't see this, but she knew, because every time they tried it, she would sling the plate at the wall, smash it, and would not take what she considered tainted food in. How could she have known? You know? Yeah, and another case I alluded to there being a car crash, you know, Father Steiger sees this black cloud or mist materialize in front of his space. It throws him off his game while he's driving, drives into a ravine, could be hurt. Isn't killed or seriously hurt, thank goodness. Has to walk back to Earling, right? No motorists pass him on the road, or they would have picked him up. He gets back to the convent, and Father Reisinger knows he's been in a car crash. And when Father Steiger says, "How could you possibly know that?" he said, "Anna told me." So, I mean, telepathy, maybe some kind of remote viewing, possibly, of course. But it seems very odd that the possessed person knew about something that she could not possibly have known by conventional means.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought so.
So now you actually have talked to certain people that had secondhand experiences with Father Theo.
Yeah.
And said that, well, not so much in a word, but have kind of carried on the tales of Father Theo, and kind of alluded that there's a little bit of tension between the two priests, and that maybe things weren't what they seemed between the two priests, and that there was some other behind the scenes stuff, and
there was a little tension. Really is not, doesn't convey it. They split, they fell out, they had a big falling out in the aftermath, and we're not entirely sure what the reasons for that were. I can tell you that Father Steiger stayed in Earling because I went to his grave. I made my own little pilgrimage. You walk up the hill in the cemetery, and he's buried at the top of the hill, and is still remembered today, which I love. People do leave small offerings and tokens at Father Steiger's grave. Father Reisinger went back to being a traveling itinerant exorcist. So he was seen as a bit of a renegade, a bit of a loose cannon by the church, you know. He definitely was a showman. He was very P.T. Barnum-esque, which isn't to say that he wasn't a man of devout faith and didn't believe what he was doing. You know, he gave his life to the church, but definitely he had a flair for the theatrical, and he teamed up with Anna/Emma after the exorcism because she was having prophecies, and she became kind of a rock star of her own. People came from far and wide to consult her and seek her, like ancient Greeks went to the oracle. You know, they believed she could tell the future, divine the future. And she prophesied that the devil would return to earth along with Jesus for the final battle in the 1950s. Spoilers, that never happened. Yeah, this divide between Reisinger and Steiger was a very real one. It's unfortunate. Something happened over the course of that case, or how it was handled afterwards. And it's really sad. I find it, you know, a great shame that they never reconciled.
All right. Well, when we come back, I want to talk about a case where sometimes a demon isn't a demon. We'll talk about that when we come back. I also want to talk, we'll get into the St. Louis case as well, but we'll talk when we come back. And I want to talk about a particular person that you've talked to in the book that might have given you the greatest shock. It gave me a shock as well, Richard, and might have changed the way that I think about demons. We'll talk about a particular bishop in the book that has quite a shocking outlook as to what he thinks about demons, and might have changed the way I think we all think about demons. We'll talk about that to end the actual program today. The name of the book is In Search of Demons, Historic Cases and Firsthand Experiences from Experts and Skeptics Alike. It is put out by Llewellyn Press. We have a link to it in the description of this program. Go out and get it during the break. When we come back, more with Richard Estep right here on the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. Welcome back to the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Tim Dennis. My guest, Richard Estep. The name of the book, In Search of Demons, Historic Cases and Firsthand Experiences from Experts and Skeptics Alike. It's got a foreword by Michel Belanger. It's got plenty of people that you, I'm sure, have heard of in this book, including Jason Hawes, Jeff Belanger, Dr. Kieran O'Keefe. The names are stacked in here. Richard, you've outdone yourself. Lots of people you've heard of. One of the people you may have heard of, that as I say it now, it's escaping me. Karen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Karen Dahlman.
Karen Dahlman. Yes, we've had her on the show quite a few times. Karen Dahlman, people may think Ouija board, but Karen also has a day job. in which she's a psychologist. And she deals with a thing called DID. Explain to people, Richard, what DID is and why it comes in handy in your book. It turns out that she diagnosed a particular person who had this disorder, which could be the reason why people may think they have a demon inside them.
Yeah, it's important to not just cover the kind of spiritual aspects of the subject of demons, but you have to look at the psychological components too. So DID is what used to be called multiple personality disorder, where an individual splinters their personality into several parts. Usually as a result of severe trauma, it's a protective mechanism. And Karen is a licensed professional therapist. So she dealt with a case in which a patient had a dominant personality that called itself demon and spoke in this, we've all seen movies, right? In this just kind of harsh, guttural growl when the demon personality was in control. And Karen it tried to intimidate her, which good luck intimidating Karen Dahlman. If you've ever met her, that woman is a force of nature, especially if she's on a dance floor, I would say. But it didn't intimidate her, and Karen reasoned with it and was actually able to work with this personality, which wasn't literally a demon, but took on the characteristics of one in order to not only express some of these dark and negative emotions that this poor abused client had, but also to protect as best it could against future trauma.
Yeah. And a fascinating story. Again, I want people to go to the book and read fully about it, because sometimes, folks, a demon isn't necessarily a demon. It can be mental illness. And the story is fascinating. It really is. It's such an interesting story. And the way that Karen comes up with the way to draw this personality out is absolutely brilliant. My respect became tenfold for Karen after reading that story. So really, it was an amazing story. I really love the fact that you included Karen in the book there, Richard.
Thank you.
Want to skip ahead and talk a little bit about the St. Louis haunting. I don't think a lot of people realize how much William Peter Blatty did kind of he didn't fully lean on this story for The Exorcist, but parts of it are taken for the Exorcist movie.
And Earling too.
And Earling too. But fill us in a little bit on the St. Louis haunting. I mean, of course, our good friends, the Booth brothers, covered it in their movie. But tell us a little bit about this case and why it's so fascinating still to this day.
Well, I think we're fascinated because it's burned into our consciousness. That image we have that is the movie poster, of Father Merrin standing in the light coming from that bedroom window. It's iconic, It's as iconic as the windows of the Amityville house as a stock image. So everybody, whether you've seen the movie or not, knows that image. And to think that case had a basis in reality was absolutely terrifying. So many of the facts of the case were rolled into the novel and subsequently the movie adaptation. Of course, there's a great degree of exaggeration. Nobody levitated, no head spun all the way around, nobody came down the stairs like a spider or anything like that. But if you look at the symptoms displayed by Emma/Anna in Earling and by Ronaldhunkeler in St. Louis, that you mishmash them together, you get the movie The Exorcist, almost unquestionably. So this was a teenage boy, and in 1949 had begun to show signs of what was believed to be demonic possession. Again, if you want the best account of this case, I recommend Troy Taylor's book, The Devil Came to St. Louis. But briefly, he's Lutheran and the family's Lutheran, and Lutherans do not have demons as part of their theology, There are no Lutheran exorcisms. So the family went to their pastor, as you're supposed to do in such cases, and were told, it's a great line, you should go to the Jesuits. They know demons, as indeed they do. And so you get these two priests, the younger one and the older one, Father Bowden and Father Bishop. And I think you don't even need to squint when you look at the movie and you see Max von Sydow as Father Merrin and you see Jason Miller as Father Karras. You know, he's a boxer, he's scrappy, he looks like he's gone a few rounds. This is kind of the personalities of the two lead exorcists. I mean, one of them was an airborne combat veteran from World War II, a guy that jumped into combat out of planes and then treated dead and dying soldiers and gave them the last rites. This is not a man who is fanciful, imaginative, and he does not scare easily at all. Yeah. So they give Ronaldhunkeler this assessment, and they determine that, yes, it's their belief that he is possessed. Exorcism, permission for an exorcism is sought from their bishop. It is given. It begins at the boy's uncle's house in Belle Noire, which is a suburb of St. Louis, then continues on at the Alexian Brothers Hospital on the university campus. And that house is the only building still standing from this whole case today. And over the space of, again, several weeks, the boy is repeatedly exorcised. He's baptized Catholic, so he takes on the Catholic faith. His family are around him. And what's interesting is he seems to be relatively normal in the day. And as the day becomes afternoon and becomes evening, his personality starts to change. And by the time it gets dark, this monster is coming out. He is aggressive. He is blasphemous. He is crude. Again, he throws punches and kicks. He has to be restrained. He speaks in multiple voices, including the devil himself. Interestingly, there are good angelic voices that start to come through this boy as well, which is really interesting. It implies that there is some internal spiritual struggle going on, you know. But more often than not, the voices are crude, again, claiming to be the devil. When he's given a pen or a pencil, he writes and draws things on the white bed sheets, messages. He starts to have wounds spontaneously appear on his skin, cuts, bruises, wheals. Sometimes they spell words like hell. And he states that his intent, he being the possessing entities, state that their intent is essentially to drive the boy and his family away from the church, to disabuse them of their faith in God. So that's kind of the stage set for this battle, which is dramatized in the novel and the movie, of course, where the exorcists just are working every night without respite to try and free the boy.
I have to ask you this question here, Richard. And I know it's brought up a few times in the book. I want to get your perspective on it.
Okay.
That is this. There's a couple of different scenarios in these different exorcisms where there are some priests who lose their life early because of putting forth different energies and trying to dispel these demons through exorcisms. There's others who priests live longer lives. Although they seem to double and redouble their efforts, they believe that they're getting their energies from God. And that God is giving them more energies to dispel these demons. Again, the mind's a wonderful thing. You believe, and again, we've talked about placebo effects between you and I off the air.
Yeah.
What do you believe? Do you believe that someone can call up a reserve of energy to pass that energy on to someone to fight through something? Or do you believe that someone can call up a reserve of energy or get an adrenaline rush and carry themselves further? Or do you believe someone can actually burn themselves out trying to get through a certain scenario?
It's a great question. One thing that it reminds me of is if you ever talk to somebody who works in a senior living facility, they will often tell you, and you might notice this with members of your own family, that when somebody's going to die, an older person is going to die, you know, their life is coming to an end, they're sick. They will often live to see an event that has significance for them, or they're looking forward to it. Maybe it's the birth of their first great-grandchild. Maybe it's just Christmas. You know, the number of deaths immediately after Christmas is kind of striking, or New Year or something like that. So I think there is something about the human spirit that you can't just measure in physiologic terms, that some people do burn out young. I think some people tire of life, unfortunately. And I also do think that we look at events and dates of significance and we want to meet those milestones, you know, when we're invested in them. And then once that milestone has been met, I think it becomes less important to us. And I believe that may curtail certain people's lifespans. You have to have something to live for, right? Or what's the point?
Is the idea that, especially for a Catholic priest, the idea that evil is never ending, the battle is never done.
Mhm.
It's the idea that eventually you can't win the fight overwhelming, and that would take a priest out early.
I do wonder. I mean, I think about it myself as a paramedic. There is always that next heart attack. There is always that next stroke. There is always, everybody dies, right? We all are born with a terminal condition. And I think spiritually that is true as well. But I think, it was interesting that Reisinger said that exorcists die young. When he was interviewed for the papers, he said, yeah, this work takes a toll. Exorcists die young. He died at an old age, like in his 70s. Steiger died in his 40s.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But Reisinger did so many more exorcisms than Steiger did. It was Reisinger's bread and butter, whereas it was unusual for Steiger. So if any of them should have died young, it should have been Reisinger. There is this belief, though, that, as you kind of alluded to, they are given special powers, special dispensation from above. So maybe that prolongs their lifespan. But he was convinced that, those that do exorcisms are generally going to die young.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you believe it, I mean, belief is so powerful, Tim. If 10 people tell you this morning, man, are you okay? You don't look good. You sick? You're going to start to feel crappy by noon.
Yeah.
They must know what they're talking about, right? 10 people have said that to me today, or 5 people, or even 3. You might start to believe it.
Really, it is. The mind is a wonderful thing. If you believe you're going to get better, you will get better. But if you believe you're ill, you will go downhill quickly.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a factor. Like, obviously, you're not dispelling a serious illness like cancer and so on purely with mental mental state. But it is proven that survival is positively affected based upon mindset. Mm-hmm. That has been proven by multiple studies. So if you are engaged and if you have something to live for and you are in the fight, your chances of surviving it are better with that positive mindset. That's indisputable.
I think I want to talk about one other scenario here before we get to the bishop that changed, I think, our mindsets here, and then we'll leave people for today. The one person I read about in the book that surprised me, shocked me a little bit, is Aidan Sinclair.
Yeah.
He's and we'll talk about Aidan here. Aidan is a magician who works at a very well-known haunted hotel in your neck of the woods. Tell us a little bit about Aidan's background and why he was surprised. He was asked to go along on an exorcism, and you would talk about the ultimate in a skeptic being asked to debunk an exorcism. And what was the result of this? Because I think people will be a little shocked about it.
Yeah, Aidan is a reformed con man, a con artist, as he would tell you himself. He's made no secret of his past, did some jail time to atone for his crimes, learned magic in jail, now teaches magic to disadvantaged kids, by the way, and tells them that there are better ways to succeed in life than crime. So Aidan is a top-notch illusionist. He's been on Penn and Teller Foolers. He did well on America's Got Talent. He and I worked together at this hotel, this haunted hotel, became friends. And I wanted to ask Aidan, as a world-class illusionist, how much of what we see in exorcism movies and how much of what we hear, levitation, those kind of things, how much of that, which does not seem to be documented with video evidence, by the way, how much could you as an illusionist fake? Because, I mean, you're the people that saw people in half, and stuff like that. How much of it, if I gave you an unlimited budget, could you fake the symptoms of possession? And so we talked about it, and obviously he'll never give up any secrets, nor should he. But he said, yeah, I could make someone levitate and flip and rotate and things like that. But if you got within 6 feet of me, you would know that there were mechanisms at play. You would see behind the curtain. Like, you would not be able to sustain that in a room full of people who were gathered around you within touching distance. So that was useful information, Right. And Aidan is very skeptical. When we started at this hotel, he was not a ghost guy. He changed that view after working there for several years and now has a multitude of ghost stories. But the key thing is that he casually told me, oh, yeah, I was asked to be an observer in an exorcism once in Wyoming. The church asked me to go and look and see if there were signs of fakery afoot, which I think is brilliant. You know, the church making an honest effort to determine if this was a credible case or not. So Aiden went to observe. It was a female. Again, as we see in so many of these cases of possession, fine during the day, but as it gets dark, as night falls, this other personality, this mindset takes over. And Aiden is watching this woman take on a different personality, get aggressive. They're having to hold her down because she's thrashing. We've all seen this in the movies and on TV. And remember that as an illusionist, sleight of hand is his thing. You know, he doesn't just pull rabbits out of hats. He is great about making you think something is in one hand and not the other. That's what he does.
Right.
So he has a St. Michael with him, a protective medallion, St. Michael the Archangel. And he gets within touch. He's behind this lady. That's the key thing. There's no way she could know it. And he's got this St. Michael palmed, and he slips it into the pillowcase, under the pillowcase. He steps back, and the priests and people in attendance allow the ergumen, the possessed lady, to rest her head back. Her head touches the spot on the pillow beneath which lies the St. Michael, and she yowls like she's been burned, like he has burned her. Now, there's no way she can know he slipped this thing into her pillowcase. And he said, I have no explanation for it. And I asked him, you know, do you think what you saw in that room, in that place, was a genuine case of possession? And he would not nail his colors to the mast, but he said, I don't have a good explanation for it. And this is a man who sees through trickery, who plans trickery. You know, that's his everyday. So it impresses me that someone so skeptical and such a keen observer, someone so meticulous and detail-oriented, was not able to explain the behavior of this supposedly possessed woman.
Yeah.
And also it's worth noting, Tim, that Aiden is a former paramedic, as I am. Yeah. So he's familiar with behavioral crises, emergencies, psychoses, things like that. He said that that was not sufficient explanation in his view either.
Yeah. I find that particular chapter fascinating, that he tried to break down everything with her, everything medically, psychologically.
Yeah.
Went through it thoroughly, and yet still had no explanation, was not quick to say demon, didn't say the word demon.
Did never say the word demon.
Never said the word demon. Never came out of his mouth.
But I don't know, in the paranormal field, I don't know, I think is the single most powerful phrase we have. Yeah. And I think that we sometimes leap to demon as a convenient explanation, especially if it fits into our belief system. I always ask people, what makes you so sure this is demonic versus an aggressive human haunting? You know, there are aggressive human individuals that pass on, and they would be violent to you in life. Why would they not be violent to you in death? What makes you think that instead you are dealing with some horned, fire and brimstone, sulfurous smelling thing from the pit, as opposed to an aggressive dead human?
Right.
So I don't know is my favorite phrase in this field.
Yeah. And it's the most refreshingly honest. And it's not a cop-out. I know a lot of people who are uneducated about the field, who think I don't know is a cop-out. And a lot of people who are looking for answers, a lot of lay people who are looking for answers, who think that I don't know is a cop-out.
Right.
Especially when they go to a so-called expert and say, well, I need an answer. You need to tell me what's going on. No, sometimes I don't know is the best answer you're going to get.
It is. And, you know, just to piggyback on that, in medicine, a lot of the times we don't have a definitive diagnosis. I don't know is a valid answer. And then what do? You don't throw up your hands, you treat the symptoms. And you continue to assess, you continue to monitor, you gather more information, you treat the symptoms. And one phrase that really stuck with me was someone who is a qualified psychologist, you know, who I thought would definitely be more on the skeptical side and was, but the phrase was, if an exorcism might make them feel better, give them an exorcism, which I thought was, wow. Now, that being said, more people die of exorcisms each year, unfortunately, in certain parts of the world, than from alleged possession. exorcisms can be fatal, but those are usually protracted and drawn out affairs, you know. An exorcism can be a relatively short process as well, or it can be a long, convoluted, ongoing thing depending on the nature. But I think it's not, if a person believes they are possessed, whether they are or aren't, and if they receive an exorcism and it does them good, I don't care what I believe. I don't care what you believe. If it's beneficial, give them an exorcism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe it's the person we're about to talk about next, or it might have been someone else, who said an exorcism should only be a brief thing that happens once or twice, and then the offending spirit is gone. It shouldn't be something that happens repeatedly over and over and over again over years and years and years. If it happens over and over and over again over years and years and years, you're looking at some sort of mental issue. And I'm
Yeah.
who it was who said that.
Well,
Was it Bishop Brian Owlett?
I would have to go back and check. I don't recall who made that exact statement, and remember, it's a year since I wrote this book. But I will say this, that you know, we have to consider mental illness as a cause. And because you have mental illness doesn't necessarily mean you aren't dealing with something paranormal, right? I've never understood the idea that if somebody has a history of mental illness, that makes them an unreliable historian, or it makes them somehow questionable. I mean, you factor it in, but I have mental illness. I'm a diagnosed depressive. I take medication for it. And there's a real stigma to it. Doesn't mean that if I'm experiencing something paranormal, that my experience isn't valid. On the other hand, if I'm hallucinating, or if hallucinations are a side effect of the medications I take, as they are with a number of medications out there, that has to be factored into the assessment of the situation. We have to be careful not to jump to conclusions, but we also have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, Tim.
Right. That's a brilliant segue into Bishop Brian Owlett, who I think has actually changed the way that I see this issue. Now, there's a couple of different people who contribute to this book who have changed the way that I've started to think about this whole demon issue.
Yeah.
And the way that we are bringing things upon ourselves. And you and I talked about it a little bit, and I know my theory was a little discombobulated to you here, Richard. So I guess I'll try to explain it the best I can the second time around.
Okay.
We'll start by talking about Bishop Brian Owlett. And I want you to kind of introduce Bishop Owlett, Bishop Brian, and how you found him and what it was that was so remarkable about him to you. And we'll go from there. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I pieced my little issue together.
Sure. Well, Brian is a member of the Old Catholic Church, which is ironically the newer Catholic Church. You know, the more traditional Catholic Church has its exorcists. I couldn't get any of them to talk to me. And I understand that, and I respect it. So Brian is a member of the Old Catholic Church. I think has a very progressive view of this situation. And he's performed exorcisms himself in the past as well. And if there was one interviewee for the book, I had expected to be a traditionalist that was to be very kind of fire and brimstone, you know, in his approach to the subject. I would have thought it would be a man with bishop as his title. Instead, that proved not to be the conversation that we had.
It was a very enlightening and interesting conversation. If I can read from the book for a second here, Richard.
Please.
An interesting passage in a quote from the bishop. Having to do with, he says, objectively within the range of human experience, they do exist, talking about demons, because Richard had asked, this leads me to the question I'm asking every single interviewee for this book. Does Bishop Brian Owlett believe in the literal existence of demons? He says, objectively within the range of human experience, they do exist. He replies, after giving the matter a moment's thought. However, once we step outside the range of human experience, they are something completely different than what we expect them to be. He says the term psyche comes from the Greek word for soul. And from here, we derive the term psychology. So the modern person, psychology is a common field of study. Every university offers a psychology degree, and indeed, I have one myself. To the ancient mind, there was no difference between the world of the mind and of the spirit. Today, when we talk about the spiritual world, we're referring to a non-physical dimension that's meant to be somewhere out there, a place that's inaccessible to us as physical beings. To the ancients, however, that separation didn't exist. They saw the spiritual world as being the world within the human mind.
Interesting, isn't it?
Very interesting. So, in other words, and he elaborates. So he elaborates to this, and this is what he says. He says, basically, in order to understand the subject of non-corporeal creatures, we have to bear in mind that they evolved out of ancient societies that did not distinguish between the thoughts in the brain and the spiritual world. To them, the external physical world was seen as being a shared experience, and the internal workings of the mind were regarded as being the spiritual realm, the place where we would commune with God. Hence, psychology. So, in other words, you have a thought, okay, something happens in the brain.
Yeah.
If it only happens in my brain, that's a thought.
Right.
If something happens in my brain and you see it, it's a spiritual experience. All of a sudden, we're having a shared experience.
Yeah.
That's a spiritual experience. If I see a demon manifest in front of me and you see it, Richard, well, by gosh, there's a demon. But if I see a demon in my head and you don't see it, well, that's mental illness.
Or hallucination, which
Or
again may not be mental illness, right? There are other reasons why people see things, and again, hallucination is one of them. So, but it certainly is not the take I expected from a bishop, and I'm really grateful that I had that conversation with Brian.
So this got me to thinking. Now, Jeff Belanger notes in the book that in the Jewish religion, they have Dybbuk, which are spirits that kind of piggyback on a person.
Right.
And they tend to be more of the evil,
yes.
evil suggestion or evil persuasion. And they kind of, they're backseat drivers. They tend to tell you, well, if you want to go ahead and rob that liquor store, go rob that liquor store. I won't stop you, but I'll suggest little things. Right. But you also have positive spirits. If you want to lose some weight, yeah, I'll help you lose weight. So you've got both good and bad right there, right?
Well, and the ancient Greeks, we talk about this in the book too. The ancient Greeks believe in the daimon, which is demon with an added A, so Daemon. And this was a possessing spirit which would spur you on to great things. So it was commonly believed that Alexander the Great had a daimon that compelled him to go ever onwards, to conquer. He was restless, It's been a whole week since I conquered a country. Should probably get on the march with the boys again, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But crucially, while that wasn't seen as evil, and indeed it could spur you on to excellence, there was always a price to be paid for the daimon. And usually such people were seen as both cursed and blessed at the same time, which I find fascinating. And just as a fun aside, if you are a Unix computer person, anyone that knows that language, we have daimons that run in that language today, and it is a term for a process that's always running in the background doing stuff that the user is never consciously aware of. This concept of a daimon, though, the idea that it would be a possessing spirit that could benefit you, but would also ultimately be your downfall. And of course, Alexander died young, right?
Right, exactly.
But we still speak his name all these years later.
Right. Yes,
so, yeah, he was certainly spurred on to excellence, and he certainly was cursed at the end.
Right. Got me thinking to another thing. I'm watching TMZ the other day. Don Lemon is on. He's talking about this new book he has, which is talking about his religious background. And
right.
I Once Was Lost, I believe is the name of the book.
Okay.
He talks about the parable of Adam and Eve, which got me thinking Adam and Eve. And he talks about the Bible being a book of parables. And I went, wait a minute, the biggest parable of all is Adam and Eve, right? Yep. Adam and Eve, again, being a parable. You talk about Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden because they took a bite out of the apple. Mm-hmm. Think about the actual parable, if it is a parable, okay? Some people believe it's literal, some people believe it's a parable. But if you think of it as a parable, It's a principle of this, Richard. And it got me thinking, if we're talking about these spirits that go along for a ride, like a Dybbuk, or us actually accessing something that God didn't want us to access.
Right.
Okay. We didn't take a bite of the apple, but what we did with our minds, and we're talking about what Bishop Brian is talking about, we actually tapped into something we weren't supposed to tap into with our minds. We opened a portal. We opened a portal to something evil with our minds. We're supposed to tap into something good. We're supposed to be able to tap into God. That spiritual connection. Psychics do it all the time. They tap into the spiritual world. They make that connection with God. But we weren't supposed to tap into the evil side of things. Whether you believe it's demons, whether it's the lower forms of things. Again, I hesitate to use the word demon. I want to say lower forms of spirits. Dybbuks, call it what you will. Lower forms of things. I won't say demon in this case, okay? Just the bad things. We'll say bad things. I believe in a universal balancing, yin and yang, okay? So we tapped into the bad with the good. In that parable, God had to cast us out, let's say, into the real world. We won't say out of paradise, but into the real world, into the cold, to teach us that, hey, you now need to know balance. You have to go out on your own and find out for real what it's like. You have to find balance now because you've chose to see what both sides are like. You now have to live with both sides.
Right.
You have to live with everything because you chose to tap both sides with the mind. Now you get to drive the ship. You have to deal with both. You get to choose, again, quantum mechanics, get to drive the ship with your mind. Okay. So we get to form this world based on our desires, based on our thoughts. We form the world around us. Hence, like you and I were talking about before the show, somebody decides they want to shoot up a school. And I hate to use this example, but this is the most violent one. If they're going to shoot up a school, they feel like they're oppressed by their schoolmates, and they get that intense feeling like they're pushing me. I'm hated. I hate them, but they would never do it on their own. Maybe they thought about it, but they would never do it on their own. But their mind has tapped that evil place, and they need that one thing to push them over. Maybe they've opened that portal, and that one little spirit, I'm not going to call it a demon because it's not, but that one evil spirit works its way in and goes, hey, kid, maybe this is that one thing. Maybe you ought to go do it. Maybe you ought to pick up the gun and do it. It's that little Dybbuk that latches itself on and says, why not? Because you always hear after these shootings, my kid would never do that. That's not my kid. Maybe that kid has a mental illness issue. Maybe that kid has other issues going on, but it was that one thing that put him over. I don't have the answers, folks, but I'm just saying, maybe through our minds, we push that portal open, and that's what brings in that spirit. It's a theory. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Again, there's that I don't know, Richard. Yep. But that was the theory. Thoughts?
Yeah, let me offer a counterpoint to that, Tim.
Yes. Go ahead.
When it comes to the one thing that pushes somebody over the edge, I think that before we go near a paranormal explanation, let's look at ourselves. And I also think that when you look at someone who's, whether they're mentally ill or not, whose life has spiraled out of control, who has become a hell of maybe their own making or somebody else's, or more likely, a whole perfect storm of bad circumstances. Sometimes it's an unkind word or a post or something that another human does which pushes them over the edge. So we might not be able to control paranormal, aspects. But I think if we're all a little kinder, if we are all a little more aware of what we say, especially in the times we live in now, when times are troubled, we can all agree, and we're at each other's throats more than we ever have been before. If we can go the extra mile to be kind and compassionate and not cruel or callous, I think that we can make great strides with one another as humans, and let the demons look out for themselves.
Fair enough. That's a good perspective too. I'm not saying every school shooting is a demon or a Dybbuk or anything like that. I'm just offering another perspective as to why the world's going to hell in a handbasket, because right now we may be living in hell. You never know. But I completely respect your outlook on things as well. I mean, it's again, just another theory.
Thank you, Tim.
Again, I want to tell people, go out and get the book, because again, fair balanced look at this whole phenomena of demons and whether they exist or not. The book is In Search of Demons: Historic Cases and Firsthand Experiences from Experts and Skeptics Alike. It's put out by Llewellyn Press. Go out and get it right now. Richard Estep has been our guest. Richard, I just want to add one last note. As we're taping the show today, it is September 11th. You are a paramedic. I want to thank you for your service and everything you've done over the years. I know it's a somber day, and I know you took time out today from this somber day to tape with us today. And I want to thank you for everything.
Thank you, Tim. And a big thank you from both of us to everybody that's standing watch out there in the 911 system, and also everybody that is in uniform and keeping us safe. We appreciate you today of all days.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you, everybody. That'll do it for today. Again, we'll see you tomorrow for more in the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio.
For more audio and video archives of the show, please visit darknessradioshow.com. Thank you for watching.